Chapter 1. The Charity Tea at St. Mary Mead. The vicarage garden had never looked lovelier than it did on that particular Saturday in late June, when the annual Church Restoration Fund tea was held beneath the horse-chestnut trees, and nobody in St. Mary Mead could have guessed that by 4 o'clock a man would be dead among the delphiniums. Miss Jane Marple arrived, as she always did, precisely 15 minutes after the appointed hour, so as not to appear too eager, and yet not so late as to miss the arrangement of the tables. She wore her good grey coat despite the warmth, carried her knitting bag over one arm, and settled herself in a wicker chair with an excellent view of the entire lawn, the tea urn, the cake stall, and, most usefully, the little door through which the kitchen maids came and went with trays. "You look very comfortable there, Miss Marple," said the vicar's wife, Griselda, pausing with a plate of sandwiches. "Not joining in the games?" "Oh, I find I see rather more sitting still," Miss Marple said placidly, and began to knit. It was, by any measure, a splendid turnout. Colonel Reginald Ashby, retired from a long and by all accounts distinguished career in India, stood near the rose arbour, holding forth to a small group about the iniquities of the modern income tax. He was a big man, red-faced, with a moustache the colour of steel wool and a laugh that carried across the lawn like a foghorn. Beside him, looking rather smaller and greyer by comparison, stood his nephew Peter Ashby, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers who had come down from London the week before and had, according to the grapevine that ran more efficiently through St. Mary Mead than any telephone exchange, quarrelled with his uncle over money on at least 2 occasions since his arrival. "He does go on so," murmured Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with the air of a woman glad to be off her feet. "The Colonel, I mean. Arthur says he was quite the tyrant out east. Had a native servant flogged once, or so the story goes, though one never knows how much to believe." "One never does," Miss Marple agreed, though her needles did not slow, and her pale blue eyes continued their unhurried survey of the lawn. There was, she noted, a positive traffic of scones that afternoon. 4 ladies of the parish had each contributed a batch to the tea table, and there was, as always at these functions, a certain delicate rivalry about it. Mrs. Prentice's plain scones with strawberry jam, Miss Hartnell's rather heavy ones, made to my mother's own recipe, 40 years in the family. Young Mrs. Lucas had brought a tray of fruit scones, done the French way, which had raised several eyebrows among the more conservative element, and Mrs. Ashby herself, the Colonel's wife, a thin, anxious woman named Constance, had contributed a plate of small plain scones dusted with sugar, set apart from the others on a separate cake stand near the urn. It was this last plate that caught Miss Marple's attention, though she could not, at that moment, have said precisely why. The tea itself proceeded much as such teas always did. There was the usual scramble for the shade when the sun came round. There was a small crisis when little Tommy Bantry Simmons was discovered to have eaten an entire plate of jam tarts meant for the raffle. There was Miss Hartnell's booming assessment of everyone else's contributions, delivered with the particular relish of a woman who considers herself a connoisseur. And there was Colonel Ashby, moving from group to group with his teacup in hand, receiving compliments, dispensing opinions, and, Miss Marple observed, drinking rather more of the sherry cup than was perhaps wise for a man of his age and colouring. It was young Mrs. Lucas who eventually brought the Colonel a plate. 2 scones, split and buttered, taken, Miss Marple was almost certain, from Constance Ashby's separate plate near the urn, though in the general crush of the afternoon, she could not have sworn to it. The Colonel took the plate with his usual booming thanks, settled himself in a deck chair beneath the largest chestnut tree, and began, with evident enjoyment, to eat. He got through the first scone without incident, complaining only, in a voice that carried, that Constance had gone soft on the butter as usual. He took 1 bite of the second, and then he made a curious sound, not quite a cough, not quite a gasp, and his teacup slid from his hand into the grass. For a moment nobody moved, for it is a peculiar fact of English village life that a certain kind of commotion is at first mistaken for a joke, or a feint, or some medical trifle that will resolve itself if one simply waits. Griselda, to her credit, was the first to hurry over, followed by Dr. Haydock, who had come to the tea in his professional capacity as much as his social one, being the parish's only physician. But by the time Dr. Haydock reached him, Colonel Ashby was beyond any help that tea and sympathy could provide. His face had taken on a strange bluish tinge. His big hands, still smeared with butter, had gone quite rigid at his sides, and his eyes stared upward into the chestnut leaves with an expression of considerable surprise, as though he had been about to say something further about the iniquities of the income tax, and had been interrupted before he could finish. "Heart," said someone in the crowd that had gathered, with the confident air of village diagnosis. "Always said he drank too much of that sherry cup." "Poor Constance," said someone else. Miss Marple, who had risen from her wicker chair, along with everyone else, said nothing at all. She stood a little apart, her knitting still in her hands, and looked, not at the Colonel, who was beyond her help now, and not at his weeping widow, who was being led away by Griselda, but at the cake stand near the urn, where a plate of small, sugar-dusted scones, made by Constance Ashby's own hand, now stood entirely empty. She looked too at the faces of the small crowd gathered beneath the chestnut tree, and thought, though she would not have said so aloud, not yet, not until she was a good deal more certain, that somewhere among these pleasant, tea-drinking, cake-judging faces of St. Mary Mead, there was a face that was working rather too hard to look shocked, and not nearly hard enough to look sorry. Dr. Haydock straightened up at last, his expression grave. "I shall need to speak to Inspector Slack," he said quietly, to Griselda. This was not, I think, his heart, and Miss Marple, hearing this, resumed her knitting, though her fingers, for the first time that afternoon, moved rather more slowly than before. Chapter 2. The Scone That Never Arrived. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, driving his car up the vicarage lane with the particular haste of a man who feels that speed is a substitute for thought, and by 5:30 the tea tables had been cleared of guests, though not of crockery, and the vicarage garden had taken on the peculiar hush that falls over a place where something dreadful has happened. "Poison," Dr. Haydock said, without preamble, when Slack found him in the vicar's study. "I'll want a post-mortem before I say more, but the symptoms were consistent with one of the alkaloid poisons, possibly taken in something he ate or drank in the last hour of his life. Cyanosis, rigidity, that catch in the throat before he went. It wasn't his heart, Slack, whatever the village is saying." Inspector Slack, a vigorous man who confused energy with efficiency, received this news with the air of one already assembling a case. "Poisoned at a church tea. Well, that narrows it down nicely. Can't have been more than 50 people milling about with the run of the food tables. I'll have statements from the lot of them before nightfall." It was, as Miss Marple could have told him, exactly the wrong way to go about it, for 50 people all telling the truth as they remembered it, which is to say, imperfectly and coloured by their own small vanities and grudges, produces not clarity, but a positive fog of contradiction. But Miss Marple was not consulted, not yet, and so Inspector Slack proceeded to interview the ladies of the tea committee with the brisk confidence of a man cutting a hedge with a great deal of enthusiasm and very little precision. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had gone quietly to find Griselda in the vicarage kitchen, where the vicar's wife was distractedly stacking teacups that did not need stacking, in the manner of a woman who needs her hands occupied while her mind works at something else. "It's too dreadful, Miss Marple," Griselda said. "In my own garden. And poor Constance, she's taken to her bed, quite overcome. Though I must say," she added, lowering her voice, "she didn't seem overcome so much as frightened. Does that sound very unkind of me?" "Not unkind at all, my dear, merely observant. Grief and fear look a good deal alike to the casual eye, but they are quite different things, and I have found that people who are frightened, rather than grieved, are generally frightened of something quite specific." Miss Marple settled herself at the kitchen table, her knitting once again in her lap, though she was not, at that moment, doing very much of it. "Tell me, Griselda, do you recall who arranged the cake stall this afternoon? The tables, I mean, and which plate went where?" Griselda considered. "Miss Hartnell always takes charge of that, self-appointed, you understand, though nobody has ever had the courage to object. She likes everything set out just so, with little cards naming who made what, so that everyone may be given proper credit, or blame, depending on the scone." She smiled faintly, then caught herself, as though smiling were unseemly on such an afternoon. Constance's plate was set rather apart from the others, now that I think of it, near the urn, on its own little stand. I remember thinking it looked almost as though it were meant to be kept separate, or as though someone wished it to be easily found. Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. She spent the better part of the next hour in unhurried conversation with the kitchen maids, two sturdy girls named Ivy and Doris, both of whom had spent the afternoon carrying trays back and forth between the vicarage kitchen and the garden. And it was from Ivy, a round-faced girl with a gift for noticing small things, that Miss Marple learned the detail that Inspector Slack, in his enthusiasm, had entirely overlooked. "Funny thing, Miss Marple," Ivy said, wringing a tea towel between her hands. "There was supposed to be 24 of Mrs. Ashby's scones on that plate. I counted them myself when I set the stand up, on account of Miss Hartnell wanting everything counted, so there'd be no argument later about who ate more than their share. 24, all sugared on top, nice and neat. But when the Colonel's plate was made up, that was young Mrs. Lucas did that. I believe, said she wanted to bring the Colonel something particular, seeing as he'd praised her French scones so. There were only 22 left on the stand. 2 gone missing before ever the tray went round properly. 2 scones, Miss Marple repeated, and her needles at last resumed their steady click. Not eaten, for nobody had yet properly begun on that plate, had they, Ivy? But taken, and by whom, I wonder, and to what purpose, before ever the tea began in earnest. Couldn't say, Miss Marple. I was in and out of that kitchen a dozen times. Anyone might have slipped round the side of the stand and helped themselves, and no one the wiser, what with all the coming and going. It was, Miss Marple reflected, as she made her way home along the lane in the lengthening light of the summer evening, a small discrepancy, the sort of thing that Inspector Slack would dismiss, if he heard of it at all, as the natural wastage of any village tea, where children pilfer from cake stands and nobody thinks the worse of it. But Miss Marple had lived a long time in St. Mary Mead, and had learned that small discrepancies were very often the loose thread by which the whole ugly pattern of human wickedness could, in time, be unpicked. 2 scones, taken before the tea properly began, from a plate set apart from all the others. It suggested a foreknowledge that someone had known, before ever the guests arrived that afternoon, precisely which plate the Colonel was likely to be given, and had made their preparations accordingly. That meant, Miss Marple thought, pausing at her garden gate to look back at the vicarage lights twinkling through the trees, that the poisoning had not been a matter of opportunity seized in the general muddle of the afternoon, but a thing planned by someone who understood the small rituals of a village tea well enough to use them as a weapon. That narrowed the field a good deal more usefully than Inspector Slack's 50 suspects, for it meant the guilty party belonged, as thoroughly as Miss Marple herself, to the intimate and watchful little world of St. Mary Mead. She let herself into her cottage, put the kettle on from long habit though she did not, this particular evening, much want tea, and sat down to think about the Colonel, about India, and about the particular quality of fear she had seen, or thought she had seen, in Constance Ashby's face, before ever Griselda had mentioned it to her. Chapter 3. Whispers Behind the Urn. The post-mortem, when its results reached the village 3 days later, by way of Dr. Haydock, who could always be relied upon to let slip rather more to Miss Marple than official procedure strictly allowed, confirmed what everyone had by then more or less concluded for themselves. Colonel Ashby had died of poisoning by a substance Dr. Haydock termed, with the careful vagueness of a man awaiting a full laboratory analysis, an alkaloid of the belladonna family, though not one in common use, and administered, so far as we can determine, in something eaten rather than drunk, given the concentration found. Which means the scone, Miss Marple said, when Dr. Haydock called upon her that afternoon, ostensibly to inquire after her rheumatism, but in truth, as they both understood perfectly well, to compare notes. Or something on it, or in it, jam perhaps, or the butter, or the sugar dusted on top, Dr. Haydock agreed. Slacks had the remaining scones from Constance Ashby's plate analysed, the 22 that weren't taken, and they're perfectly innocent, which means whatever killed him was in one of the 2 that went missing before the tea began, and never in the batch at large. A neat piece of work, whoever did it. Poison the 2 scones destined for the Colonel specifically, and leave the rest of the plate harmless, so that no general alarm is raised and no one else is hurt, or suspected. Neat and cold-blooded, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing, for it required the poisoner to know, in advance, that the Colonel would very likely be given scones from his wife's own plate, a natural enough assumption, since a man is generally offered his wife's baking first, out of politeness if nothing else. and it required access to those scones before the tea properly began, when the kitchen was full of comings and goings, and no one plate was yet being watched. "You suspect the kitchen, then? One of the maids?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple carefully, "that whoever did this knew St. Mary Mead a good deal too well to be a stranger to it, Dr. Haydock, and that is a great deal more alarming than suspecting a kitchen maid, who has, after all, no particular reason to wish the Colonel dead, and everything to lose by being caught in such wickedness. No, I think we must look rather closer to the Colonel's own hearth than that," she began over the following days, what she would have described as nothing more than her usual round of village calls: tea with Mrs. Bantry, a visit to the vicarage to help Griselda with the flower rota, an afternoon spent discussing her garden with Miss Hartnell over the dividing fence. But each of these small encounters yielded, in Miss Marple's patient way, another thread in the pattern she was piecing together. From Miss Hartnell, delivered at considerable length and with a great deal of relish, came the intelligence that Colonel Ashby had been anything but popular in the village, despite his booming good humour, and that there existed no fewer than 3 persons with what Miss Hartnell termed, in her direct way, very good reason to wish him in his grave. There was his nephew Peter, cut off from the family fortune some years before, over what Miss Hartnell darkly called an unsuitable entanglement in his youth, and only lately readmitted to his uncle's good graces, though the terms of his inheritance remained, so far as anyone in the village could determine, distinctly uncertain. There was Constance herself, who had married the Colonel late in life and had, according to Miss Hartnell's sources, which were, as ever, of a nature Miss Hartnell declined to specify, suffered a great deal more than she ever let on, and who could blame her, married to a man like that? And there was most intriguingly a woman named Laura Fenwick, who had come to live in the village only the previous spring, ostensibly to be near her elderly aunt, but who had been seen, on more than one occasion, in what Miss Hartnell described as earnest private conversation with the Colonel in the churchyard, of all unsuitable places. "And who is Miss Fenwick, precisely?" Miss Marple inquired, her needles moving with the particular evenness that indicated close attention. "That," said Miss Hartnell, with satisfaction, "is exactly what nobody has been able to determine, though I have my own theory, and it concerns India, Miss Marple, and something that happened there 30 years ago, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple did, in a general sense, take her meaning, though she was too well practised in village gossip to accept any single theory whole and unexamined. She had learned, over a long life of listening over garden fences, that gossip was a rich vein of ore, requiring careful sifting for its grain of genuine gold. But the mention of India interested her greatly, for it was the second time that word had arisen in connection with the Colonel's death, first from Mrs. Bantry's remark about a flogged servant, now from Miss Hartnell's speculation about Laura Fenwick, and Miss Marple had long held the private conviction that a detail recurring from more than one unconnected source is generally worth a closer look. It was Griselda, in the end, who provided the piece that gave Miss Marple's suspicions their first real shape. Sorting through the flower rota in the vicarage study, with the window open to the June evening and the scent of the roses drifting in, Griselda mentioned, quite in passing, that Constance Ashby had called upon her that very morning, in considerable distress, not over her husband's death, but over a letter. She wouldn't say what was in it, Griselda said, only that it had come the day before the tea, and that she'd burned it in the kitchen grate that same evening, and that she wished to heaven she never had, because now there was no proving what it said, and she was afraid. Griselda stopped, frowning. She didn't finish the sentence, Miss Marple. She just went quite white and said she must be going, and left without so much as finishing her tea. Afraid, Miss Marple repeated softly, of being believed, or of not being believed. Those are 2 very different fears, my dear, and I confess I should very much like to know which one it was that sent Constance Ashby running from your parlour with her tea unfinished. She resolved, sitting there with the roses' scent thick in the warm air, that her very next call would be upon Constance Ashby herself, not the frightened widow that the village had already decided her to be, but a woman who had burned a letter the night before her husband died, and who knew, Miss Marple was now quite certain, a great deal more about the manner of his death than she had yet told anyone at all. Chapter 4. The Vicarage Tea Table. Constance Ashby received Miss Marple in the small morning room of Ashby House the following afternoon, a room that struck Miss Marple immediately as belonging to a woman who had spent a great many years making herself as unobtrusive as the furniture around her. The chairs were good but unremarkable. The photographs on the mantel showed the Colonel in various poses of military and sporting triumph, with Constance appearing in perhaps one frame in four, always at the edge, always half a step behind him. "It's very good of you to call, Miss Marple," Constance said, pouring tea with hands that were not quite steady, "though I confess I can't think why. We've never been close, you and I." "No," Miss Marple agreed placidly, accepting her cup. "But I find that in times of trouble, people are sometimes glad of a visitor who is not close enough to have expectations of them. Expectations of grief displayed in a particular fashion, or of confidences shared in a particular order. I have no such expectations, Mrs. Ashby. I have come only to sit with you a little, if you will allow it, and perhaps to talk of your husband if that would not distress you too greatly." Constance's hand, lifting her own cup, trembled visibly enough that a little tea slopped into the saucer. "Everyone wants to talk of Reginald," she said, with a sudden, unexpected bitterness, "as though I could tell them anything they don't already believe they know. He was a great man, a distinguished soldier, a pillar of the parish. That's what they'll say at the funeral, and it will all be perfectly true, and it will not be the whole truth, not by a very great distance." Miss Marple said nothing, only inclined her head slightly and waited, for she had learned long ago that silence, properly deployed, drew out confidences that direct questioning only frightened away. "He was not a kind man," Constance said at last, very low. "Not to me, and not, I think, to a great many people over the years, though he had the knack of seeming jovial to anyone who didn't have to live with him. India changed him, or perhaps it only gave him room to become what he already was. There were things done out there, Miss Marple, that he never spoke of to me directly, but that I pieced together over the years from things half said, from old army friends who drank too much at dinner and let slip more than they meant to, a native clerk dismissed without a character over some trifling irregularity in the accounts. Dismissed, and worse, though I never learned quite how much worse. A young woman—" Constance stopped and pressed her handkerchief briefly to her lips. "A young woman," Miss Marple repeated gently, "who may have some connection to a Miss Laura Fenwick, now living in this village." Constance's head came up sharply. "You know of her, then?" "I know only that her name has been mentioned to me in connection with your husband, and that she has lived here scarcely a year, and that her arrival seems, on reflection, rather too well timed to be entirely coincidental. Who is she, Mrs. Ashby?" There was a long pause, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. "I believe," Constance said finally, "that she is the daughter of a woman my husband knew in India, knew and wronged, in some fashion involving a promise made and not kept, and a child born who ought, by rights, to have carried the Ashby name and never did. I don't know that for certain, Miss Marple. I only know that Laura Fenwick came to this village last spring, and that within a month of her arrival, my husband had begun receiving letters that made him irritable and secretive in a way I had never seen before, not even in his worst tempers, and that he took to meeting her, quite openly, as though he no longer cared who saw, in the churchyard of all places, twice that I know of, and probably more that I don't. And the letter you burned," Miss Marple said, very quietly, "the evening before he died, was that from Miss Fenwick?" Constance went white, exactly as Griselda had described. "How did you—" She stopped herself, the last of her careful reserve giving way. Yes, it was from her. She wrote that she knew the truth now, all of it, and that she intended her mother should have justice at last, whatever the cost to the Ashby name. I burned it, because I could not bear for the servants to find it, and told myself it was only a woman's angry words that would come to nothing. And then he died the very next afternoon, poisoned before half the village, and I have thought of little else since, that I destroyed the very evidence that might have told the police who wished him dead and why, and did it not to protect him, but because I was ashamed that the whole ugly story might come out. That is a very human reason, Mrs. Ashby, and no crime in itself, whatever Inspector Slack might make of it, if he learned you had destroyed a letter." Miss Marple set down her cup with the small, precise click of porcelain on saucer. "But I must ask you one further question, and I would ask you to consider it carefully before you answer. On the afternoon of the tea, did you yourself prepare the plate of scones that was later given to your husband?" And did you, at any time before the guests arrived, leave that plate unattended near the kitchen door, where anyone familiar with the arrangements of the tea might have had access to it?" Constance's eyes widened with a dawning horror that seemed, to Miss Marple's practiced eye, entirely genuine. "I baked them that morning, yes, and set them out myself on the stand near the urn, exactly as I always did. It was expected of me, you understand, that the Colonel's wife's baking should have pride of place. And then I went to help Griselda with the trestle tables, and I was gone the better part of half an hour, and anyone at all who knew our little customs, might have come to that stand and done whatever they pleased, and I should never have known until it was too late." Miss Marple rose to take her leave a few minutes later, declining Constance's mechanical offer of more tea, and walked home deep in thought. She had learned much that afternoon, of India, of a wronged woman whose daughter sought justice, and of a widow whose shame had led her to destroy evidence that might have solved the case at a stroke. But she had also learned that the plate of scones had stood unattended for the better part of half an hour before the tea began, which meant the list of possible poisoners was longer and more troubling than even Miss Hartnell's gossip had suggested. It was time to make the acquaintance of Miss Laura Fenwick. Chapter 5. Letters from India. Laura Fenwick lived in a small rented cottage at the far end of the village, near the old mill, with an aunt so elderly and so deaf that she featured in the household chiefly as a kind of respectable fiction, allowing Laura to live independently without occasioning comment. Miss Marple, calling the following morning with a jar of her own gooseberry preserve as pretext, found her a striking young woman of perhaps 28, dark-haired, with a directness of manner that Miss Marple, who had encountered a great many varieties of guilty evasion in her time, found rather refreshing. "You've come about the Colonel," Laura said, before Miss Marple had properly seated herself. "Everyone has been coming about the Colonel, in one fashion or another, ever since he died, though most of them pretend they've come about something else entirely. You, at least, brought preserve." "I find honesty saves a great deal of time," Miss Marple said, settling into the offered chair. "And I understand you have some considerable reason to have wished Colonel Ashby ill, Miss Fenwick, which I think we may as well discuss directly, since you seem disinclined toward pretense." Laura's chin lifted, but she did not flinch. "My mother was Rosalind Fenwick. She worked as a governess in the household of a British family in Lahore 30 years ago, where Colonel Ashby, then a young captain, was a frequent guest. He courted her, quite seriously, for the better part of a year, with every appearance of honourable intention, and when she found herself with child, he denied all knowledge of the relationship and had her dismissed on a manufactured accusation of theft, so thoroughly discredited she could find no further employment in any respectable household in India. She came home to England in disgrace, with an infant and no family willing to receive her, and she died when I was 11, worn out, I have always believed, by grief and poverty, a braver man than Reginald Ashby would never have permitted. She said all this in a flat, controlled voice that Miss Marple recognised as the voice of someone who had rehearsed the story many times in the privacy of her own thoughts, polishing its edges until it could be delivered without breaking. "I came to St. Mary Mead a year ago," Laura went on, "when I learned, through an old India connection of my mother's, that Reginald Ashby had retired here in comfortable respectability, with a knighthood likely on its way, and his wickedness entirely forgotten. I confess I came with some notion of confronting him, of making him acknowledge what he had done to my mother, even if the law offered no remedy for a wrong 30 years old. I wrote to him. I met him, twice, in the churchyard, because he was too great a coward to be seen with me anywhere more public. And in that last letter, the one I sent the day before he died, I told him I had found, among my mother's effects, letters in his own hand that proved everything. His courtship, his promises, his full knowledge of my existence. I told him I intended to make the story public, whatever the cost." "And did you," Miss Marple asked, very steadily, "intend anything further than that, Miss Fenwick? Did you intend that he should not live to see that story made public?" For the first time, Laura's composure wavered. "I will not pretend I did not hate him, Miss Marple. I will not pretend that when I heard he had died, my first feeling was not something very like satisfaction. God forgive me for it. But I did not poison him. I had no access to that tea, no opportunity even to approach the food tables. I was not even invited to the charity tea, being, as you may imagine, no great favourite of the parish committee, and I spent that entire afternoon at home with my aunt, who will vouch for me, deaf as she is, for she at least knows whether I was in the house or not. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that an alibi involving a deaf and elderly relative was rather less watertight than its bearer generally supposed, nevertheless found herself inclined to believe the substance of Laura's account, if not necessarily its every particular. There was a rawness to the young woman's anger that struck Miss Marple as genuine rather than performed, and genuine anger, in Miss Marple's long experience, was very often not the anger of a person who has already taken her revenge and need feel it no longer, but of a person still waiting, still hoping, for some acknowledgement that would now never come. "Tell me," Miss Marple said after a moment, "did you show these letters, these proofs of your mother's story, to anyone else in the village? Anyone at all?" Laura hesitated, and it was a hesitation Miss Marple noted with particular care. "I showed them to Peter Ashby," she admitted at last, "the Colonel's nephew. We met, quite by accident, at the lending library some months ago, and got to talking, and I found him a good deal more sympathetic than I had any right to expect from a member of that family. I told him the whole story eventually, and showed him copies of 2 of the letters, because I wanted someone in this village to know the truth of what his uncle was, even if nothing ever came of it in a legal sense. Peter was very quiet about it. I thought at the time it was shock. Now I wonder—" She stopped. "Now you wonder," Miss Marple finished for her, "whether it was something rather colder than shock, whether a young man cut off from his inheritance and recently readmitted to his uncle's favour on terms he perhaps did not entirely trust, might have found your mother's story a very useful piece of information indeed, not to expose the Colonel publicly, which would have served Peter no material purpose whatsoever, but to understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly what manner of man held his own financial future in his hands, and exactly how little that man's good opinion was worth in the end." Laura said nothing, but her silence was, to Miss Marple's practised ear, its own kind of answer. Miss Marple took her leave shortly afterward, walking back along the lane past the old mill with her mind turning over this new thread. Peter Ashby, in possession of a secret that gave him both motive and, potentially, opportunity, if he had been anywhere near the kitchen during that unattended half-hour before the tea began. It was time, she thought, to have a proper conversation with the Colonel's nephew, and to learn a great deal more about the precise and troubled state of his inheritance. Chapter 6. The Disputed Will. Peter Ashby, when Miss Marple finally contrived to encounter him, by taking her knitting to the bench outside the village library, at an hour when she knew, from Laura's account, he was in the habit of visiting, proved a young man considerably more nervous than his uncle had ever been, with the pallor of someone who has not been sleeping well. "Miss Marple," he said, with the wary courtesy of a young man raised to be polite to his elders, even when he would very much rather not speak with them at all. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "No, but I knew your uncle a little, and I understand you've had rather a difficult time of it since his death. Difficult in ways that go beyond the natural grief of losing a relative, if you'll forgive my bluntness." Miss Marple patted the bench beside her in unmistakable invitation, and Peter, after a moment's hesitation, sat. "Everyone in this village seems to know everyone else's business," he said, not without a certain bitter humour. "I suppose you know about the will, then, and the money, and all the rest of it. I know that there was some difficulty over an inheritance, and an unsuitable entanglement in your youth, though I confess the details have not reached me with any great precision. I should be glad to hear them from you directly, if you're willing, rather than from the village grapevine, which is not always reliable in its particulars." Peter was silent for a long moment, turning his hat over in his ink-stained hands. "I fell in love, 4 years ago, with a girl my uncle considered entirely unsuitable, an actress, if you can imagine the scandal that word alone provoked in a family like mine. He cut me off without a penny, and told me I should never see a shilling unless I gave her up and married, as he put it, someone of proper standing. I did give her up, in the end, not only for the money, but because she grew tired of waiting for a man too cowardly to defy his own uncle, and left me for someone with more spine. I came back to my uncle a year ago, tail between my legs, and he readmitted me to something like favour, though he made clear the will remained entirely at his own discretion, to be altered on a whim if I displeased him again. And had you displeased him recently, Mr. Ashby? I understand you quarrelled with him on more than one occasion since your arrival. Peter's jaw tightened. We quarrelled because I learned, this past spring, exactly what sort of man he had been in India. Things I'd only heard hinted at before, dismissed as old soldier's exaggeration. I learned it from Laura Fenwick, whom I expect you've already spoken to. When I confronted my uncle with it, not to blackmail him, but because I genuinely wanted to understand how a man could behave with such cruelty and still sit in church looking perfectly satisfied with himself, he flew into a rage and told me that if I ever repeated a word of it, he would cut me off and leave every penny to a charitable trust for retired cavalry horses, which I rather think he'd have done purely out of spite. So you had, at the time of his death, every reason to fear your inheritance was once again in jeopardy, and every reason, perhaps, to feel that the world would be considerably improved by his absence. I won't pretend I didn't think it, Peter said, with a candour that Miss Marple found, on the whole, rather to his credit. But thinking a man better off dead and killing him are two very different matters, Miss Marple, and I give you my word, I did neither poison him nor arrange for it to be done. I wasn't even at that infernal tea until nearly 3:30. I'd gone into the county town that morning on business, and only got back in time to see the last of the sandwiches being cleared, let alone anywhere near the kitchen or the cake stands when everything was being set out. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. That is easily verified if true, and I should advise you to make certain Inspector Slack knows precisely where you were, for I fear you present, on paper, a very tidy suspect indeed, a disinherited nephew with a grudge, a secret to protect, and a fortune to gain. That will not save you from Inspector Slack's straightforward manner of thinking, unless you can produce witnesses. I can, Peter said, with evident relief at being asked the question directly at last, rather than merely suspected in silence. The solicitor in the county town, and the bank manager, and the fellow who drove me back on the afternoon bus, if it comes to that. I was nowhere near St. Mary Mead until the whole dreadful business was very nearly over. Miss Marple nodded slowly and resumed, for a moment, her knitting, while she turned over what she had learned. If Peter's alibi held, and she rather thought it would, then the field narrowed again, back toward those present in the vicarage garden during that critical unattended half-hour. Constance, the kitchen maids, young Mrs. Lucas who had carried the fatal plate, and one further name that had not yet received the scrutiny it deserved, Miss Hartnell herself, self-appointed arranger of the cake stall, who knew better than anyone exactly which plate belonged to whom. There is one more thing I should like to ask you, Mr. Ashby, Miss Marple said, as she rose to take her leave. Did your uncle, to your knowledge, ever discuss his will, or any intended changes to it, with anyone besides yourself and his solicitor? A servant, perhaps, or a friend he trusted more than most? Peter frowned, considering. Now that you mention it, he did mention, only a week or so before he died, that he'd had a long talk with Miss Hartnell about it. Something about a bequest to the Church Restoration Fund, and whether it ought to come out of his estate directly, or be arranged some other way. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Miss Hartnell involves herself in everyone's business, as you well know, Miss Marple, and my uncle rather liked her for it, oddly enough. Said she reminded him of a regimental sergeant major, which from him was high praise indeed. Miss Marple thanked him and walked home slowly, her mind now turning, with a good deal more attention than before, to Miss Hartnell, and to the curious fact that a woman who professed to know everyone's business had contrived, in all her gossiping, never once to mention discussing the Colonel's will with him directly, shortly before his death. Chapter 7. A Jilted Heart. It was Mrs. Bantry who supplied Miss Marple with the next piece of the puzzle, over a game of bridge at the Bantry's house 2 evenings later, when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did that summer, to the Colonel's death. You know, of course, about Miss Hartnell and the Colonel, Mrs. Bantry said, laying down her cards with the air of a woman more interested in gossip than the game. No, I don't suppose you do. It's rather old history now. But my mother-in-law, who remembers everything, once told me Miss Hartnell was engaged, 35 years ago, to a young officer who went out to India and never came back, wrote her a letter breaking it off, quite cruelly, and married an army colonel's daughter out there instead, for the sake of the connection, or so the story goes. Miss Marple's needles paused, very briefly. And do we know, Dolly, who that young officer was? Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened with the particular delight of a woman realizing, mid-sentence, that she has said something of genuine significance. Why, I never thought of it until this moment, but I believe it was young Reginald Ashby himself, before he was ever a colonel. Isn't that extraordinary? All these years, living in the same village, taking tea at the same functions, and neither one of them ever breathing a word of it to anyone. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way home that evening, beneath a sky just beginning to show its first stars, precisely the sort of old wound a village like St. Mary Mead was built to conceal, not through active conspiracy, but through the tactful forgetting small communities practice upon their own painful histories, until even those most concerned behave as though the wound had never existed. She called upon Miss Hartnell the following morning, ostensibly to discuss the church flower show, a subject upon which Miss Hartnell held opinions of such volume that no one had ever successfully changed the topic once raised. But Miss Marple, with the patience of long practice, waited out the flower show entirely, agreed to every one of Miss Hartnell's proposals about judging the sweet pea category, and then said, into a small pause, "I understand you knew Colonel Ashby a very great deal longer than the rest of us, Miss Hartnell, since before he went out to India, in fact." The effect of this remark upon Miss Hartnell was immediate and striking. Her large, confident face, which had held throughout the flower show discussion its usual expression of settled certainty, went suddenly quite still, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, an unusual enough occurrence in itself to confirm to Miss Marple that she had struck very near a nerve indeed. "I don't know who's been talking," Miss Hartnell said at last, none of her customary boom in her voice. "But yes, I knew Reginald Ashby when he was a young lieutenant, and I was 22 and considered myself the luckiest girl in the county. We were engaged the better part of a year before he went out to India, promising to send for me once he was settled. I waited 18 months for that letter. When it came, it was 3 lines long, informing me he had formed another attachment more suited, as he put it, to a man of his ambitions. That must have been a very great cruelty to bear, Miss Hartnell, and at so young an age. I built a life without him, as women of my generation learn to do, whatever the poets say about broken hearts. I never married. No one after Reginald seemed worth the risk of a second such disappointment, and made myself useful in this parish instead, telling myself over the years that I had entirely forgiven him, and that when he retired here, 20 years later, with that thin wife of his on his arm, I felt nothing beyond ordinary courtesy for a new arrival. And did you feel nothing at all, Miss Hartnell? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was a steadiness beneath it that did not permit of evasion. Miss Hartnell's hands, folded in her lap, tightened visibly. I felt a great deal, Miss Marple, though I am not proud of most of it. At first, the old hurt reopened raw as ever. Then, as the months passed and I saw him settle into this village as though he owned it, accepted everywhere, that ridiculous knighthood forever spoken of as a foregone conclusion, I felt something a good deal uglier than hurt, that it was not right he should behave as he had, to me and others less fortunate, and suffer no consequence, while I had spent my whole life alone, making do with flower shows in place of the family I had once hoped for. And is that why you discussed his will with him, Miss Hartnell? Only a week before he died, or was there some other purpose to that conversation? One you have not, I think, mentioned to anyone else in the village, though you have been remarkably free with everyone else's business. Miss Hartnell's composure, which had been visibly fraying throughout this exchange, finally gave way entirely, and for a moment Miss Marple saw, beneath the large, confident, gossiping woman the village had always known, something a good deal smaller and sadder, and a good deal more dangerous. "I asked him for money," Miss Hartnell said, in a voice quite unlike her usual boom. "For the church fund, yes, but also, God forgive the shame of it, for myself. My own savings had dwindled a great deal more than anyone here knows, and I thought, foolishly, that a man who had wronged me so thoroughly owed me some small restitution, now fortune had smiled on him. He laughed at me, not unkindly, precisely, but with an amused indifference worse, in its way, than cruelty. He told me the past was the past, that I ought to have found a husband when I had the chance, and that he saw no reason to reward what he called my 40 years of sulking with a single penny. "And how did that make you feel, Miss Hartnell?" "It made me feel," said Miss Hartnell, with sudden and terrible honesty, "precisely as though I could have killed him myself, Miss Marple. And I will not pretend otherwise to you, since you have clearly already guessed as much. But wishing a man dead and poisoning his tea are two very different matters, whatever novels may suggest to the contrary, and I tell you plainly that I never touched that plate of scones, nor any other food at that tea, beyond arranging the stands as I always do." Miss Marple, walking home with her mind considerably more troubled than her placid expression suggested, reflected that she now had 4 persons with genuine motive: Constance, humiliated for years; Laura, avenging her mother's ruin; Peter, fearing for his inheritance; and now Miss Hartnell, nursing 30 years of bitterness freshly reopened. The true difficulty lay not in finding a motive, of which St. Mary Mead seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply, but in determining which of these wounded hearts had possessed, besides sufficient reason, the particular opportunity and knowledge of poisons the crime required. Chapter 8. The Kitchen Ledger. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had not been idle, though his energies had produced, by his own admission to Dr. Haydock over a pint at the Blue Boar, a great deal of smoke and precious little fire. He had questioned every guest, compiled a list of grievances against the Colonel so extensive he wondered whether the man had a single friend in the county, and arrived at no conclusion more useful than that the murderer must have access to poison, a description that, in a village full of gardeners with rat-bane in their sheds, described nearly everyone. It was Miss Marple, calling upon Dr. Haydock under pretext of her rheumatism once again, who suggested a line of inquiry that Inspector Slack, in his enthusiasm for interviews and statements, had entirely neglected. "The poison itself, Dr. Haydock," she said. "You mentioned it was an alkaloid not in common use. I wonder whether you might tell me a little more precisely what it was, and where such a thing might reasonably be obtained by an ordinary person in an ordinary English village." Dr. Haydock, who had come to regard Miss Marple's questions with the respect due a colleague, consulted his notes. "The full analysis came through yesterday. It was hyoscine, derived from plants of the nightshade family, though in a purity suggesting deliberate extraction, rather than mere garden foliage ground up, which takes some knowledge of chemistry, or a good book and patience. It's used, carefully measured, as a sedative, and formerly, in obstetric practice, though it's fallen out of fashion there, owing to its dangers. A layperson would find it hard to obtain through ordinary chemists in quantity, but not impossible with a plausible medical pretext, or access to a doctor's dispensary, or," he paused, frowning, "a connection to India, where such preparations were rather more freely available and less closely regulated than here at home." "India, again," Miss Marple murmured. "It does keep returning to India, doesn't it, Dr. Haydock, in one fashion or another? I wonder whether I might trouble you for the name of any local person who has, to your knowledge, access to your own dispensary, or who has consulted you recently regarding sedatives, or nerve troubles, or any complaint for which hyoscine might plausibly be prescribed." Dr. Haydock weighed the proprieties of a physician's confidence against the graver claims of a murder investigation, and said at last, "I prescribed a mild sedative to Constance Ashby myself, some months back, for nervous exhaustion, though the dose was a fraction of what would kill a man, measured out in a bottle locked in my own dispensary, to which she'd have had no independent access." He paused. "And Miss Hartnell asked me, some months back, a great many questions about the medicinal properties of garden plants, for an article on old-fashioned remedies," she said. "I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple received this information with her usual outward calm, though her mind was working a good deal faster than her placid expression suggested. 2 threads, both leading back toward the possibility of poison, obtained through knowledge rather than mere opportunity. Constance prescribed a sedative from the same family of substances, however carefully measured, and Miss Hartnell, making inquiries into garden poisons under cover of a parish magazine article. Neither was conclusive. Both were suggestive. It was Ivy, the round-faced kitchen maid, who provided the next and, in its way, the most important piece of the puzzle, when Miss Marple called at the vicarage kitchen once more, ostensibly to return a borrowed cake tin. "I've been thinking on it, Miss Marple, as you asked," Ivy said, wiping her hands on her apron with the air of someone pleased to have settled a matter. "About who was in and out of that kitchen during the half-hour before the tea began, when Mrs. Ashby's plate sat unwatched near the urn. I made myself a list, in my head, of everyone I saw come through that side door, since Doris and I were both in and out fetching the last of the sandwiches, and hadn't a moment to watch the stand close. That is exceedingly clever of you, Ivy, and exactly the sort of observation I had hoped you might supply. Pray tell me everyone you remember." Ivy counted them off on her fingers, frowning with concentration. There was Mrs. Ashby herself, setting the plate down first thing. Then Miss Hartnell came through, checking the name cards, and I remember she paused rather a while at Mrs. Ashby's plate, longer than at the others, though I thought nothing of it then. Young Mrs. Lucas came through with her own tray, and stopped to admire Mrs. Ashby's plate. And then there was a fourth person I nearly forgot entirely, since she wasn't properly one of the tea committee, and had no real business in that kitchen. A young woman I didn't know, dark-haired, who came to the side door asking whether she might borrow a jug of water for her aunt, feeling faint in the lane outside. I fetched the water myself and didn't watch what she did while my back was turned, though she'd have had no more than a minute or two alone by that stand before I came back. Miss Marple's needles had gone entirely still. A dark-haired young woman, Ivy, asking for water for an elderly aunt feeling faint in the lane. Can you recall anything further about her? Her dress, perhaps, or her manner? Well-spoken she was, though a bit tense about it, like she was in a hurry to be gone. Wore a blue dress, I remember, and gloves, which struck me as rather odd for such a warm afternoon, though I didn't think much of it at the time, beyond that it seemed a queer thing to fuss over gloves when your own aunt was feeling faint. Miss Marple thanked Ivy warmly and walked home with her thoughts arranged, for the first time since the Colonel's death, into something approaching a clear and troubling shape. Laura Fenwick, who claimed to have spent the entire tea afternoon at home with her deaf aunt, had in fact been seen at the vicarage kitchen door during the very half-hour the fatal scones must have been poisoned, and had worn gloves, on a warm June afternoon, of exactly the sort a careful poisoner might choose to avoid leaving any trace upon whatever substance she had brought. It was, Miss Marple reflected, turning in at her own garden gate, a very damning piece of evidence indeed, and yet something in it troubled her still, some small detail that did not sit comfortably within the neat shape the facts now seemed to be assuming. Chapter 9. Miss Marple's Knitting Needles. Miss Marple did not go directly to Inspector Slack with what Ivy had told her, though a more conventional investigator would have done exactly that, and considered the matter very nearly closed. Instead, she spent the following morning in her garden, tending her roses, but turning over in her mind, with the patience of a woman who has learned that hasty conclusions are very often the most comfortable and the most wrong, every detail gathered since the Colonel's death. It troubled her, she found, that Laura Fenwick, who had shown no hesitation in admitting her hatred of the Colonel, nor in confessing the substance of the letter she'd sent him the day before he died, should have lied so specifically and unnecessarily about her whereabouts, when a woman clever enough to plan a poisoning with such cold precision might have constructed a far better alibi than a deaf aunt who could neither confirm nor deny her movements. It was, Miss Marple thought, precisely the sort of clumsy, half-hearted lie a person tells not because they are guilty of murder, but because they are guilty of something else entirely, and are ashamed to admit it. She resolved, therefore, to call once more upon Laura Fenwick, and this time to press rather harder than she had on her first visit. "You told me," Miss Marple said, once seated again in Laura's small parlour, declining the tea offered, wishing on this occasion to keep her wits entirely about her, "that you spent the whole tea-party afternoon at home with your aunt. Yet I have a witness who saw you at the vicarage kitchen door that very afternoon, during the half-hour before the tea began, asking for a jug of water and wearing gloves on a warm June day. I should like the truth now, and I would remind you that Inspector Slack, when he learns of this, is not a man inclined to patience with young women who lie about their whereabouts on the day of a murder." Laura's face, which had held its composed, faintly defiant expression throughout Miss Marple's first visit, went now quite pale, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, twisting her hands together in her lap. "I did go to the vicarage that afternoon," she admitted finally, her voice low. "I lied because I was ashamed, not because I poisoned anyone. I went because I'd heard, from Peter, who let it slip, that my letter had arrived the day before, and I wanted desperately to know how he'd received it, whether after 30 years he'd finally felt some fraction of what my mother suffered. I meant only to watch from a distance and judge for myself whether my words had struck home. But when I reached the garden wall, I hadn't the courage to be seen there uninvited, so I invented the excuse about my aunt feeling faint, meaning only to slip in, catch a glimpse of him, and leave unnoticed. "And did you see him? Did you see his face?" "I did," Laura said, her voice cracking slightly, for the first time since Miss Marple had made her acquaintance. "I saw him through the kitchen window, laughing with some group of admirers, as though my letter, my mother's whole ruined life, meant nothing to him, no more than a fly already forgotten." I stood there with the water jug in my hand, and felt such a wave of hatred and helplessness as I hope never to feel again, because I understood that whatever I did, it would never touch him. He would go to his grave respected, and my mother would remain, to anyone who remembered her at all, a disgraced governess who had brought her troubles on herself. "And the gloves, Miss Fenwick? Why did you wear gloves on a warm afternoon?" Laura looked down at her own hands, as though seeing them freshly. "Vanity. In the end, nothing more sinister. I have a small burn scar on my left hand, from a kitchen accident years ago, and I'm foolishly self-conscious about it in company where I already feel at a disadvantage. I wore gloves so no village maid would notice and gossip. It seems a small, silly vanity now, set against everything else, but it is the whole truth of it." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, her pale eyes moving over the younger woman's face with the particular attentiveness of someone weighing a great many small signs against one another, the trembling of the hands, the steadiness of the gaze, the particular quality of shame that is quite different, in Miss Marple's long experience, from the particular quality of guilt. "I believe you, Miss Fenwick," she said at last, "though that belief may be cold comfort, given you must now tell Inspector Slack everything you have told me. But I do not believe you poisoned that plate of scones. For a woman clever enough to plan such a poisoning, and patient enough to obtain a substance as difficult to procure as hyoscine in sufficient purity, would surely have invented a far better excuse than a fainting aunt who was, at that very moment, sitting quite well in her own front parlour, 3 streets away." She rose to take her leave, but paused at the door, struck by a thought. "One further question, Miss Fenwick, if you would indulge me. In the moment you stood in that kitchen passage, watching the Colonel through the window, did you notice anyone else nearby? Anyone at the cake stand, or near the plate of scones set apart by the urn?" Laura frowned, casting her mind back. "There was someone, now that you mention it, though I paid her very little attention at the time, being so absorbed in my own bitter thoughts. A woman in a pale yellow dress bending rather close over that separate plate of scones. I assumed she was simply admiring the sugar work, or straightening the little name card, the way that large, loud woman had done a few minutes before. I couldn't tell you who she was. I only remember the dress, because it struck me, foolishly, as a very cheerful colour for what turned out to be so dreadful an afternoon. Miss Marple's needles, which had been resting quietly in her lap throughout this final exchange, began once more, very slowly, to move. A pale yellow dress. She knew already, from her own careful attention to the details of that terrible afternoon, precisely whose dress that had been, and the knowledge settled over her with the particular quiet certainty that came, in her long experience, not from any single dramatic revelation, but from the final, patient placing of the last small stitch in a very long and complicated piece of work. Chapter 10. The second poisoning attempt. Miss Marple said nothing to Laura Fenwick of the particular certainty that had settled over her upon hearing the words "pale yellow dress," beyond thanking her once more and advising her, with great firmness, to tell Inspector Slack the whole truth of her movements that afternoon, before he learned of them from some less sympathetic source. She walked home slowly, turning the matter over with the patient thoroughness of a woman assembling the last pieces of a large and difficult jigsaw, and found, as she walked, that a great many small and previously unremarkable details now arranged themselves into a single, coherent, and rather dreadful picture. Constance Ashby had worn a pale yellow dress on the afternoon of the tea. Miss Marple recalled it distinctly now, though she had given it no particular thought at the time, for a woman lingering over her own cake stand excites no comment whatsoever, being the most natural thing in the world. Constance had been prescribed, by Dr. Haydock's own admission, a sedative from the same family of substances that had killed her husband, kept in a bottle to which she alone, of anyone in the village, had regular and repeated access. Constance had spent years in India before her marriage, a fact Miss Marple had learned only that very morning from Mrs. Bantry, who recalled, upon careful prompting, that Constance's late father had been a medical missionary somewhere in the Punjab, and that Constance herself, before her marriage, had trained for some years as a nurse in her father's small mission hospital, where the preparation and careful measuring of exactly such alkaloid medicines would have been the daily business of her hands. And Constance had burned a letter, not perhaps to protect a secret already known to her, as she had claimed, but because that letter, arriving on the very eve of the tea, had told her something she had not previously known with such certainty, that her husband's past cruelties were about to be dragged into the light, that scandal was imminent and irreversible, and that a man like Reginald Ashby, cornered and humiliated, was entirely capable of protecting his own reputation at his wife's expense, by whatever means presented themselves, including, perhaps, a hasty divorce that would have left Constance with nothing at all after 20 years of quiet, careful suffering. It was, Miss Marple reflected, sitting down heavily in her own front parlour and taking up her knitting with hands that were not, for once, entirely steady, a picture of such patient and terrible calculation that she found herself almost unwilling to credit it, even as every fact she had gathered pointed toward the same conclusion. And it was, she knew, a picture she could not yet take to Inspector Slack, for she possessed not a single piece of evidence that would satisfy a court of law, only a chain of inference built from address recalled, a prescription mentioned, a missionary father remembered, and a letter burned. She required something more, something Constance herself might be induced to provide, and Miss Marple was still turning over how such a thing might be accomplished when the matter was very nearly settled for her in a manner she had not anticipated at all. It happened 2 days later, on a warm Thursday afternoon, when a small parcel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage by the hand of a boy from the village, who said only that a lady had asked him to deliver it, and had given him 6pence for his trouble, and had not given her name. Inside, wrapped in greaseproof paper, was a small plate of what appeared to be homemade shortbread, and a card reading simply, in a hand Miss Marple did not immediately recognise, "With sympathy for all your trouble over this dreadful business. Do try these. They are a family recipe, and I hope they bring you some small comfort." Miss Marple, who had spent a very long life developing what she privately termed a healthy suspicion of unsolicited gifts, particularly gifts of food arriving without proper introduction during the course of a murder investigation, did not eat the shortbread. She wrapped it carefully back in its paper, walked directly to Dr. Haydock's surgery, and asked him, with a calm that rather belied the gravity of what she suspected, whether he would be so good as to have the shortbread analysed before nightfall. The results which reached her the following morning confirmed what she had, with a cold and unhappy certainty, already suspected. The shortbread contained hyoscine, in a concentration considerably higher than any medicinal preparation would ever require, though mercifully not so high as the dose that had killed the colonel. Enough, Dr. Haydock said gravely, to have made Miss Marple seriously ill, and possibly, given her age, to have killed her outright, had she eaten more than a single unwary bite. "Someone knows you're getting close, Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock said, with unusual sharpness. "This is no longer a matter of quiet inquiry over garden fences. You must go to Slack with everything you have, and at once, whatever gaps remain in your reasoning." "I intend to, Dr. Haydock, very shortly," Miss Marple said, though her mind was already working ahead of his advice, turning over the particular shape of an opportunity she saw now, quite clearly, opening before her. "But I wonder whether I might ask you one further favour first, of a rather unusual kind, for I find I have a very strong suspicion as to who sent that shortbread, and I believe the surest way to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt is not to confront her directly, which would only put her further on her guard, but to give her one further opportunity to betray herself entirely, in circumstances where her guilt cannot afterward be explained away, as village gossip or an old woman's fanciful inference." She explained, in her characteristically unhurried and precise manner, exactly what she had in mind, and Dr. Haydock, listening, found himself first alarmed, then reluctantly persuaded, and finally, as was so often the case with those who came to know Miss Marple's methods well, entirely convinced that her plan, however unorthodox, offered the surest route to a certainty that mere accusation never could. "You mean to set a trap," he said at last. "I mean," said Miss Marple, with the particular gentleness that had, over many years, concealed a will of considerable steel from those who underestimated her, "to hold one more tea party, Dr. Haydock, and to see who, among the guests, is watching the cake stand rather more closely than the conversation." Chapter 11. The Trap of a Perfect Cup of Tea. The tea was arranged for the following Sunday afternoon, in Miss Marple's own small garden, under the guise of a quiet gathering to console the ladies of the parish for the disruption the Colonel's death had caused to the ordinary rhythms of village life. A gathering small enough, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Slack, whom she had at last brought fully into her confidence, to permit close observation of every guest, and intimate enough that no one would think it strange to be watched rather carefully by their elderly hostess. Slack, to his credit, had listened with rather more patience than he generally extended to civilian theorizing, chastened by the poisoned shortbread, which had convinced him of the seriousness of her involvement more than any amount of prior reasoning could. "It's thin, Miss Marple," he said, when she'd finished. "A dress, a prescription, an old story about a mission hospital. It hangs together, but I couldn't take it to the chief constable as it stands, let alone a jury. Which is precisely why we must give her the opportunity to hang herself a little further, Inspector, in circumstances neither gossip nor good fortune can explain away." And so it was arranged, a small tea, 5 guests only, Constance Ashby, still nominally in mourning but unable, given village etiquette, to refuse so kind an invitation, Miss Hartnell, whose old wound deserved the chance to be cleared definitively, young Mrs. Lucas, whose innocence Miss Marple wished to confirm beyond doubt, Griselda, present as a steady, observant witness, and Inspector Slack himself, seated a little apart in ordinary clothes, introduced as a cousin visiting from Much Benham, and instructed, with some difficulty to his pride, to say little and watch a great deal. Miss Marple had, with considerable care, arranged the tea table exactly as it had been arranged on the fatal afternoon at the vicarage, a plate of scones set slightly apart from the other cakes, occupying, in the small geography of her garden table, precisely the position of prominence that Constance's plate had occupied beneath the chestnut trees. She had baked the scones herself that very morning, with Ivy's assistance, ensuring that no one beyond the 2 of them and Dr. Haydock, waiting discreetly in the kitchen, knew that these scones were, in every particular, entirely innocent. The conversation proceeded, for the better part of half an hour, exactly as such conversations always did, Miss Hartnell holding forth on the deficiencies of the flower show committee, Mrs. Lucas offering nervous compliments on the garden, Constance sitting quiet and pale, her eyes moving, every so often, toward the plate of scones, with an expression Miss Marple could not entirely read. It was Miss Marple herself who, at last, rose to pour fresh tea, and who remarked, quite casually as she did so, "I do hope you will all try my scones. I confess I followed a recipe I found among some old papers belonging to a missionary family, of all things, from India. I understand hyoscine, in the days before it was properly regulated, was sometimes used out there as a folk remedy baked directly into bread, to calm nervous complaints, though I have of course used nothing of the kind in mine, only butter and sugar, as any sensible Englishwoman would. It was a small and deliberately provocative piece of invention, offered lightly, but its effect upon Constance Ashby was immediate and unmistakable. She went, in the space of a single breath, from pale composure to a stillness so absolute that Griselda later described it as like watching a woman turn to stone in her chair. Her teacup, lifted halfway to her lips, remained suspended there, forgotten, and her eyes, meeting Miss Marple's, held such naked, cornered fear that no one at the table could afterward pretend to have seen anything else. "How could you possibly know that?" Constance said, very low, and then, hearing her own words, seemed to understand, in the same instant, exactly what she had betrayed. I don't understand what you mean by folk remedy, Miss Marple. I've never heard of such a thing." "Haven't you, Mrs. Ashby?" Miss Marple's voice remained perfectly gentle, perfectly calm, though every eye at the table was now fixed upon Constance with a dawning and horrified comprehension. "I rather thought you might have, given that your own father ran a mission hospital in the Punjab for a great many years, and that you yourself trained there as a young woman, in exactly the sort of pharmacy where such old remedies were commonly discussed, measured, and prepared. I rather thought, too, that you might recognize the particular danger of hyoscine baked into bread, since it is, I understand, remarkably difficult to detect by taste, once concealed beneath butter and sugar. Rather easier to detect, in fact, in a cup of tea, where its bitterness cannot be so well disguised, which is why, I imagine, you chose to place it in the scone rather than the cup." Constance's hand, still holding her suspended teacup, began at last to tremble so violently that the cup rattled against its saucer, and the tea within it slopped over her fingers, though she seemed entirely unaware of the small scald. "I don't know what you're suggesting," she said, though her voice had lost all its former conviction, and had become instead a thin, desperate thread of sound. "I loved my husband, Miss Marple, whatever else he was." "I think, Mrs. Ashby," Miss Marple said, still very gently, "that you loved, above all, the idea of a life free from him, after 20 years of a marriage that had brought you a very great deal more suffering than anyone in this village ever properly understood, and that when Laura Fenwick's letter arrived on the eve of the tea, telling you that scandal was now unavoidable, you understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 2 decades studying her husband's temper, exactly what he would do rather than face public disgrace, cast you aside, blame you for whatever exposure followed, and leave you with nothing at all, after everything you had already endured on his behalf. And so you resolved, I think, that if the scandal could not be prevented, at the very least you would ensure that Reginald Ashby did not live to inflict its consequences upon you." Inspector Slack, forgetting entirely his instructions to remain silent and unobtrusive, had risen slowly from his chair at the edge of the garden, his eyes fixed upon Constance Ashby, with the particular gravity of a man who understands that a confession, however unfinished, is unfolding before him and must not be interrupted before it reaches its natural and necessary conclusion. Chapter 12. Sudden Death. Solved. For a long moment, Constance Ashby said nothing at all, and the small garden party sat frozen around her, in a silence broken only by the distant song of a blackbird among Miss Marple's roses. Then, quite suddenly, something in her gave way, like a dam long straining against a weight it could no longer hold, and she began to speak in a low, rapid voice, as though she had waited 20 years for someone to ask her the right questions. "You cannot know what it was like," she said, "to be married to a man admired by everyone and feared by no one but his own wife. He never struck me, Miss Marple. I want that understood. He was far too clever and too concerned with his reputation for anything so crude. He simply diminished me, day after day, year after year, in 1,000 small ways no outsider would ever have noticed, until I scarcely remembered what it felt like to have an opinion he hadn't already dismissed before I finished voicing it. When Laura Fenwick's letter came, I did not feel triumph. I felt terror, because I understood exactly what Reginald would do. He would not accept disgrace quietly. He would find some way to turn it to my disadvantage, cast me as a foolish, complicit wife, or divorce me outright before the scandal broke. So he alone appeared the wronged party, while I was left with nothing, no home, no income, no standing in the only community I had ever belonged to. "And so you resolved to poison him," Miss Marple said quietly, "using the knowledge your father's mission hospital had given you, and a small store of hyoscine you had, I think, been quietly saving from your own prescribed sedative for months before that final letter arrived. For a woman does not concentrate and purify such a substance in a single evening, however great her terror. This was not a thing decided in one moment of panic, but a possibility you had been preparing against should the day come that you needed it." Constance's head dropped, and her voice grew smaller still. "I told myself, for months, I would never actually use it. That keeping it by me was only a kind of comfort, a door left open in a house that otherwise felt without escape. But when that letter came and I understood the door led only to greater ruin, I could not simply wait and see what he would do to me. I baked the scones myself and set aside 2 of them, only 2, for I could not bear harming anyone who didn't deserve it, dusted with extra sugar so I might know them, and left them where I knew, from 20 years of village teas, he would likely be served first. And then I went to help with the trestle tables, not, as you rightly guessed, entirely by chance. I wished to be seen elsewhere when whatever was to happen, happened. And the letter you burned that same evening, Laura Fenwick's letter. I burned it because I could not bear for anyone to find it afterward and understand exactly what motive I had been given on the very eve of his death. I told myself, burning it, that I was protecting his memory. I understand now that I was protecting only myself, and I have thought of very little else these past weeks, but the particular cowardice of that small, careful lie. Inspector Slack, recovering his professional composure, stepped forward to caution her formally, in the flat language the law required, and Constance received the words with a strange, terrible calm, as though some long and exhausting struggle within her had finally, mercifully, come to its end. She was led away a little while later, walking very upright through Miss Marple's rose garden, past Miss Hartnell, whose large, confident face had gone quite grey with shock, and past young Mrs. Lucas, who had begun, rather belatedly, to weep. It was left to Miss Marple, some days afterward, to explain the fuller shape of the matter to Griselda and Dr. Haydock, over a final, quieter cup of tea in the vicarage garden, the roses nodding gently in the warm afternoon air, as though nothing at all untoward had ever disturbed their tranquil corner of England. The truly dreadful thing, Miss Marple said, her needles moving in their familiar, unhurried rhythm, is that Constance Ashby's story is not so very different from a great many stories one hears, quietly, in a village like this one, if only one troubles to listen properly. A clever, cruel man, admired by the world and feared only by the one person obliged to share his daily company. A woman diminished over many years, until she could see no way forward, except through an act she would once have considered entirely beyond her. It does not excuse what she did. Nothing excuses the taking of a life, but it explains it, and I confess I found myself feeling a very great sadness rather than any triumph in having solved the puzzle. And Miss Hartnell? Griselda asked. And Laura Fenwick, and poor Peter Ashby, all of them innocent in the end, and all of them dragged through so much suspicion and unhappiness along the way. They were dragged through it, my dear, because the Colonel himself dragged unhappiness into this village long before his death, through his own cruelties, old and new. Miss Hartnell will carry her own quiet grief a little longer, though I hope she finds comfort in having been, at the last, entirely cleared by her own honesty. Laura Fenwick has finally received proper acknowledgement of her mother's story, and some restitution besides, since Peter Ashby, who inherits everything now, poor boy, has told me privately he intends to see her fairly compensated, whatever the law itself might say. And Peter, I think, will make rather better use of his inheritance than his uncle ever did, having learned, at considerable cost, exactly what kind of man he does not wish to become. Dr. Haydock refilled Miss Marple's cup and remarked, with the dry humour of a man who had, over the course of the investigation, developed a very considerable respect for his elderly neighbour's methods, "I confess, Miss Marple, that I shall never again eat a scone at a village tea without first considering rather carefully who baked it and why." "A wise precaution, Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said, with the faintest of smiles, "though I have always found that the greater danger, in a place like St. Mary Mead, lies not in the scones themselves, but in mistaking the ordinary pleasantness of village life for evidence that no wickedness could possibly be stirring beneath it. Human nature, I fear, is very much the same in a quiet English garden as it ever was in the wildest and most distant corners of the empire, and it is only by watching closely and by never quite trusting the surface of things that one comes, in the end, to see it clearly." And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, and the tea in the vicarage garden proceeded, for the remainder of that warm June afternoon, entirely without further incident, exactly as village teas in St. Mary Mead were, on the whole, and but for the rarest and most dreadful of exceptions, generally inclined to do.